Hello and welcome to the third episode of 5 Favourite Books with me, Bella de Brera. This afternoon I'm talking again to the wonderful Greg Sheridan, foreign affairs journalist and commentator, about his third favourite book, which is called My Antonia by Willa Cather. Good afternoon, Greg. Thank you very much for joining me again.
Hi there, Bella. Great to be with you.
On this lovely winter's day in Melbourne with the hail coming down.
Yeah, it's cold and chilly, absolutely.
Actually, the weather's a good segue into this book, which is a lot about the elements, which is a lot about the seasons. It's a story of a bohemian girl in rural Nebraska in the 20th century, first published in 1918. It's an amazing novel, and I'd love to hear from you, first of all, how you came across it, because I doubt that anyone in Australia will have heard of Willa Cather, and what the book means to you.
Well, Bella, you're right. I mean, I hadn't heard of Willa Cather. So I greatly admire an American essayist and critic and short story writer called Joseph Epstein. And I was scrolling through Real Clear Politics once. So all the other books on my list are books that I first read in my teens or early 20s. They're books that I got as a young man and have stayed with me all my life. This is a book I came upon in my 50s. So I was scrolling through Real Clear Politics, and reading their book reviews section, and I read a review by Joseph Epstein of Willa Cather's collected correspondence, even though she'd left an instruction that her letters were never to be collected or published. 60 years after her death, somebody did. And Epstein, whom I greatly admire, used to read his short stories in commentary and so on, said he thought Willa Cather was the best novelist of the 20th century. And I thought, wow, that's a big claim for someone like Epstein to make. So, and he picked out 2 books of hers particularly, Death Comes for the Archbishop and My Antonia. And so I read My Antonia, and at first, so let's say who Willa Cather is and what this book is about first. So Willa Cather was originally from Virginia, and at the age of 9, she was moved to Nebraska with her parents. And so she went from a settled, established, old traditional life in Virginia to this raw frontier in Nebraska.
Sorry to interrupt. She was born in the late
1870 or something.
1870, that's right. So
something like that.
This is just when Nebraska's being opened up, where it's the frontier, isn't it?
That's right. She was born in 1873. I just checked, and so Nebraska is this really raw frontier, and she's overwhelmed by the sky and the space and the prairies. And she gets to know mainly the North European immigrants, Swedes, Germans, and Bohemians. And of course, we have to say by Bohemians, we mean people from Bohemia. We don't mean people who lived a louche lifestyle or something like that, you know. And My Antonia, which was based on a particular person she knew, is a story of this Bohemian girl who migrates to Nebraska like Willa Cather did herself, but all the way from Bohemia with her parents, and they have to tame the land. It's at one level, it's a great story of immigrant success. They make a living more or less out of their farm, but it's really a story of the divine drama, really, humanity and God. And it's the story of, it's partly the story of Nebraska, and the landscape, and everything about Willa Cather's method I don't like in general. So I hate landscape writing. I have no visual imagination. I like dialogue and intellectual confrontation and so on. But she writes absolutely magnificently of the Nebraska landscape. It's a character in the novel. I also like novels which have a lot of really clever dialogue, but a lot of the characters in this book are very ordinary folk, and they speak in an ordinary way, and some of them don't even speak great English. And then I also I like books which have a clear plot, whereas Willa Cather doesn't really do that. She just gives you the pattern of life. But to give you Willa Cather's life story very shortly, she was a very clever girl herself and wanted to be a writer, and so left home and moved to New York and became a journalist. But she wrote novels about primarily about the Midwest. She was one of the great Midwest authors. Then later on, she wrote novels with other settings in Europe and New Mexico and Canada. She never married. She was born a Baptist, became an Episcopalian, was quite devout. She wrote magnificently about Catholic priests. Death Comes for the Archbishop is the best fictional treatment of the priest's mindset that I've ever seen. Because she never married and she shared a house with a close female friend, a certain section of academic opinion has always tried to, impose on her a lesbian identity. But there's no evidence for that. Not that it would matter one way or another, but there's absolutely no evidence for that, either in her correspondence or her life or in her literature, which is full of love stories.
I read that the sort of the queer studies team have tried to make her one of theirs, but there is no real evidence either way. But as you say, it doesn't matter.
It wouldn't matter. And I think it's quite silly to try to retrospectively fit someone up with contemporary identity politics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some feminists love her because a lot of her protagonists are women, and they have great agency. Others don't like her much because some of her protagonists embody very traditional womanly virtues. They suffer suffer's probably the wrong word, but they endure. There's a lot of endurance in Nebraska, and the power of endurance is part of what she writes about so brilliantly. And a lot of the women are very traditional. So Antonia herself, although very beautiful and very clever and very talented, ends up in a very traditional role. She becomes by the novel's end, she's the mother of 10. She lives on a fairly dim farm with her fairly dim husband, and yet she is a radiantly successful human being.
Even though she's lost her teeth, she's still as radiant as she was as a younger woman. That radiance endures. In fact, her character has been described as a ray of light throughout the book. She shines in the darkness, and she shines in the hardship, and she shines and she endures, and she stays. That light stays as strong throughout the novel, from the first page to the last page, which I found one of the things that was very attractive about the novel.
Yes, I think that's right, Bella. I think that's right. Would it be all right if I read a little passage about Antonia?
Oh, please do.
Because the book is narrated by her friend Jim Burden, who is kind of in love with her, but it's not really an eros love. He just loves being with her, and was made into a fairly lame film in which, of course, they have there's a kind of a conventional love story, but she's a bit older than Jim, so it's not really a romantic love, although towards the end of the book, her friend Jim Burden goes back to see her after an absence of some years, and he writes of her, "She lent herself to immemorial human attitudes which we recognise by instinct as universal and true. I had not been mistaken. She was a battered woman now, not a lovely girl, but she still had that something which fires the imagination, could still stop one's breath for a moment by a look or gesture that somehow revealed the meaning in common things. She had only to stand in the orchard, to put her hand on a little crab tree and look up at the apples, to make you feel the goodness of planting and tending and harvesting at last. All the strong things of her heart came out in her body that had been so tireless in serving generous emotions. It was no wonder that her sons stood tall and straight. She was a rich mine of life, like the founders of early nations." And that's how she strikes her friend, who goes on to become, a very successful lawyer 20 or 30 years later, after they've been childhood friends.
Actually, it's interesting because obviously the book is narrated by her friend Jim, who arrives in Nebraska at the same time, on the same train as the whole family, and he spots her, very early on, and then teaches her how to speak English. And but you still get the sense that the novel's about her, even though that the experiences and the memories are his. So she still managed to stay the main character, even though it's narrated by someone else. And I thought that was quite an interesting way that she wrote that book.
Absolutely. I think Willa Cather is technically sort of utterly majestic. I mean, she is really an astonishing novelist. I've never really read novels like her. So as I say, all of my other favourite books, they appeal to every prejudice I have, and I feel so comfortable in them, But I came upon Willa Cather in my mid or late 50s, and at first I couldn't get what Epstein was about because her method of narration is different from the novels I normally like. There are dramatic incidents in the book, but they tend to happen off stage, and they're described indirectly. And what Willa Cather is really all about, most novelists go for the dramatic moment, the moment of epiphany, the existential moment when some deep truth is revealed or some deep development takes place in a character. Willa Cather is not a novelist of that kind. She conveys to you the pattern of life rather than the dramatic moments of life. And so the most dramatic things happen and affect you. So Antonia, through her goodness and so on, falls in love with a guy who turns out to be a scoundrel, and he's already married, and so their marriage is not real. And then she's pregnant and she's left as a single mother for a while. And but all of that is related off stage later on by Jim Burden.
Yes, as well as Antonia's father's suicide, which was a very surprising and unexpected passage in the book, but still happens off stage.
Yeah, and that's
even though it's a major, and it's a rupture in the novel. It's a rupture in the happiness of the novel. I think you suddenly have this shocking news, but it's still not central to the novel. We come back very soon to normal life, to the horses and to getting on with life. And the other point, sorry, I'm talking a bit too much here, but
no, not
about
a bit.
being a pattern of life is interesting because things don't necessarily occur to you in half an hour and are life changing. Sometimes things happen and then you realize 5 years later that's why that happened. I understand that now. That's changed my life, but it's taken 5 years to work it out. And it's similar with this novel. It takes him 20 years between seeing her and then returning to her on the farm for him to realize just how good she is.
Yes, he was always under her spell, and he always loved her in a way. But as I say, it's not primarily an eros love.
No.
It's just that being in her company made him the happiest that he could be, and he recognised the goodness in her. So she's a kind of a tremendous life force. There's a great will in her. But what you were saying earlier is right too, Bella. She doesn't glamorise immigrant life in Nebraska. It's pretty tough. The Shimerdas get to their property. They've been swindled a bit. There's only a cave on the property. There's not even a house. Her father misses the life of Central Europe. He brings his violin. He misses the culture of Central Europe.
Which is what Willa Cather missed, isn't it, when she went to Nebraska? She even missed the culture of Virginia.
She did. So in no way is Antonia Willa Cather, but Willa Cather uses her own biographical information, especially that journey. So that railway journey occurs about, in a sense, 4 times. Jim meets an old friend on that journey as an older man, which kind of frames the reminiscence of the book. And Jim and Antonia both take the journey separately as kids when they're migrating to Nebraska. And this is also the journey that Willa Cather herself took. But she certainly doesn't glamorise immigrant life, the hard labour of immigrant life. Just how hard it was to make a living out of the Nebraska prairies is there. But at the same time, and this is, I think, also fidelity to the Midwest, the people are very cultured. They read books, they play the violin, they have musical evenings, they talk deeply. And we know, there's almost nothing that Karl Marx ever said which was true. And one of the very stupidest things he said was to talk about the stupidity of rural life, the stupidity of farm life. What that indicated was the stupidity of Karl Marx. Only someone who lived their life in the London Museum and never actually amongst real rural folk could make a comment like that. Willa Cather was herself influenced more by Russian and French novelists than by English novelists. And the people in her novels work incredibly hard, but are deeply cultured and talk a great deal. They talk things over. They consider things. So she is one of the great novelists of the American Midwest. And of course, I think the outside world completely misunderstands the American Midwest. The American Midwest is one of the great cultural engines of human culture. You know, the university which has won the most Nobel Prizes in history is Chicago. Skyscrapers, the first skyscraper ever was built in Chicago. And you had, at about the time of Willa Cather, the emergence of these great Midwestern novelists, Sinclair Lewis and Theodore Dreiser and a number of others. And one of Willa Cather's other novels, the Song of the Lark, is about a great opera singer who comes from the Midwest. Well, of course, rural people often very deeply value culture. They value it more probably than people who can just switch it on Netflix and get it, but never do.
Yes, actually, when Jim grows up and moves, we move away from Antonia for a bit, and he moves to the town. Is it Black? I can't remember the name of the town.
Red Hill or something?
Red Hill. He moves to the town, and the Italians arrive. Some amazing Italians arrive with this sort of tent, and they hold dance classes every night for a year, and the locals absolutely love it, and they take to this sort of European culture and with so much gusto. Which is very interesting. And the next door neighbours, the Hardings, who are Norwegian, have a piano, and they all play from the oldest daughter to the youngest, and they are very cultured. And it really shines through. It shines through and it also shines through in terms of making the sort of the American born look less cultured. It's the Europeans that bring across with them, even though they work on the land and they'd be considered working class. They come with this antiquity and this civilization, and they bring it to Nebraska and they bring it to that part of the world.
That's right. Although I would say that's true of the native, the Americans as well, the American-born Americans. The Midwest was, quite religious, but it wasn't an insane Bible Belt or anything.
No.
But people went there to build a civilization. They didn't go there to get, I don't want to be too flip about this, but they didn't go there to get Social Security or unemployment benefits or something. They went there to build a civilization, and that's what they did. Willa Cather herself as a kid, she lived near a Jewish family which had a lot of books, and they, was it a Jewish or an Italian family?
It was a German Jewish family.
Yeah,
and she used to read their library, look at their library.
Yeah, so they let her come in and borrow any book that she liked. So a kid in a rural background will actually have the most precious gift. They'll have time for reading and reflection. And then they'll have a few friends to talk it over with as well. And we get the idea that all civilization has to occur in Manhattan or the West End of London or Sydney or Melbourne or something. But, you couldn't have produced a more sophisticated literary intelligence than Willa Cather. And it all came out of the Midwest there in Nebraska.
The deplorables are educated after all.
Yeah, that's right. A very large number of them. And of course, anyone who's lived in the US, there is an ethos, it might all be changing now, of deep courtesy in the Midwest. I've lived on 4 separate occasions in the United States, and I spent some time living in Virginia, which is not exactly the Midwest. But, we'd go out for a walk, my wife and I, and everyone you'd pass would say, well, hello there, well, howdy, or, some lovely old lady approached us who might have come straight from a Willa Cather novel and said, how lovely it is to see a wonderful young couple like you. I mean, I was then kind of in my late 40s or something, out on a sunny day. And there's this deep neighbourliness in American culture. Now, probably, digital worlds and everything are eliding all that away. But you can see the importance of neighbours in an environment like My Antonia. I mean, you have to get on with your neighbours because maybe they're the only people you're going to see for most of the week, and you want to express solidarity with them and, help them out with a bit of food when they're starting out and help them out with a bit of farm labour, and they'll help you out, and you look after each other when you're sick, and
or when the horse has colic. That was an interesting scene.
There are lovely moments too. Sorry, just a thought you provoked there, Bella. there are lovely moments of interreligious accommodation too. So the Shimerdas are Catholics. A lot of the white Americans around them are Protestants, and a lot of the other North Europeans are Protestants. And at Christmas, there's some point at which Mr. Shimerda kneels and makes the sign of the cross. And one of the Anglo families, it's happening in their house, and, you know, the dad is a bit sort of disapproving of this, you know, what kind of dreadful papist superstition is going on here. But he doesn't say anything. He just, in Willa Cather's words, he Protestantizes the moment by standing and just bowing his head slightly. You know, nothing is said between Shimerda and Burton or whoever it is.
Yeah, the grandfather.
But it's just a little accommodation of the two religious traditions.
There's a similar scene at the funeral of Mr. Shimerda where I think after the prayers, one of them says, "Shall we sing a hymn to make it less heathen?" And then they sing a Protestant hymn after the Catholic funeral, which is again a sort of similar sort of combination of the religious beliefs. But and they needed to get on. They had to rely on each other. There was no one else. And the neighbors are very important in the novel. They really feature in both halves, don't they? First the Shimerdas and Jim and his family are neighbors, and then he moves next to the Hardings, and they're just as important in his young adult life as the Shimerdas had been in his childhood.
Yes, and Jim is orphaned, so he has a little bit of a hole in his family life. And, you know, a lot of us in childhood have had a friendship where it's just been because we live next door or something like that. And so he, for the first few years of his life, lives next door to Antonia, and so they just fall into great friendship. But even now, Bella, after all these years and having read a million novels, and then I instantly went off and read all of Willa Cather's novels that I could get. So I bought them all in secondhand bookstores before the digital revolution shut down secondhand bookstores. I'm sure you can now buy them online. But I used to love going around to secondhand bookstores. I mean, all the books I love are kind of out of print and so on. So, you know, it shows what a terrible old dinosaur you can be. But her books must have circulated well in Australia once because they were easy to get in those secondhand bookstores. But I then read all of her books that I could. Some of them I liked more than others, but certainly Death Comes for the Archbishop, and there's another one set in Canada, which is...
is it called
Oh, no, there's another one, Oh Pioneers.
Oh,
but
Pioneers.
There's one, which oddly enough is one of the few that I haven't read, but the one set in Canada is Shadows on the Rock. And that's this historical novel set a couple of 100 years ago. And in those novels, she explores religious belief very deeply. But even having read all these novels, I cannot quite say where Willa Cather's true genius resides. I mean, she's defeated me as a sort of second-rate analyst. You know, I can tell you why I think Evelyn Waugh is so clever. You know, this brilliant dialogue.
Yes.
I can describe the poetic effects of Christopher Koch's prose, but I can't even quite... I mean, I can certainly find individual sentences of Willa Cather that are lovely, although she doesn't give you a purple passage. There's a simplicity and a beauty in her writing. But I can't even really say how it is that I find myself so moved by Antonia's story and so happy to be in her company.
Do you think it's because it's a truly universal novel, and it's not particular, so it touches something in your soul, doesn't it? It certainly was a very moving novel, and again, you can't really put your finger on it. Is it the universality of it? Is it the sort of that we're all living this life? We're all living this life that has a pattern that it's full of suffering and joy and happiness, and she captures that well, and she captures that sort of the memory of someone well. I don't know if I'm explaining it properly. I'm trying to figure it out as well.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot in what you say. Certainly, Antonia is a universal character, but of course, an artist only gets to the universal through the particular. So it is the living authenticity of this Nebraska background. Another book I loved was a memoir by Amos Oz, the Israeli novelist, which I think is a time of love and a time of love and madness, or something like that. And it's a beautiful memoir. It has the same nostalgic quality. But I found when I read that memoir, I could smell every beetroot in his kitchen. Just the power. So this is the artist's brilliance to bring this universal vision to life through the particular. Now, I've never been on a Nebraska farm in my life, but I felt that I knew the Shimerda's living room very, very well, and I could smell the cakes and the bread and so on that they were cooking, and I could taste the food they were eating.
Yes.
But the other thing, which I can't quite work out, is that somehow or other, Antonia is a tremendous life force, but she's a completely believable character. So she's very good. She makes a lot of mistakes, or she makes some bad mistakes. She chooses the wrong person to marry. She can't think ill of anyone that she loves. She makes a few impetuous decisions. She looks back and thinks a lot of things in her life were good. She doesn't look back and think things were bad. So she went into domestic service for a while. And when she has 10 kids of her own, she thinks, well, wasn't that great? Because I learned how to run a good house. Wasn't I lucky about that? The illegitimate daughter she has, she says, well, wasn't I lucky to have her? She's wonderful, and
she's not bitter. She's not bitter, is she? And she's not full of regret.
No. So a typical postmodern conceit is to end on a down note and say, oh, isn't life miserable? And that's in reaction to the sort of romantic cliche of ending with a marriage and isn't everything wonderful, And of course, real life is something else. It doesn't ever end. First of all, it doesn't end until you die. And second of all, it's seldom everything's perfect or everything's bad. But Antonia is someone who makes all her choices, commits to life with great energy and generosity, and is tremendously happy. So she marries this sort of fairly dim guy from Bohemia, but she brings out the goodness in him. So he realises how lucky he is to have married someone like Antonia, and then he does his best. It's not all that great what he does. He drinks a bit too much sometimes, and he doesn't produce any great fortune or fame or anything, but he loves his wife. He's grateful. He himself misses Central Europe. He says to Jim, in the early days, I died of lonesomeness, missing, I presume Prague and the other.
Yes, because he was a city man. He was a city man. He wasn't.
Absolutely.
He was completely inexperienced in the country.
Yeah, a lot of these North European migrants who came out to make a living in rural America, they weren't farmers back in Europe, so they had to learn to farm. And they maybe had never done physical labour before, and then they had to break this land and
so tough.
Plant crops and make enough crops to eat and manage their small finances. But he himself is very happy too, because he's got 10 wonderful kids, and he's got Antonia, and so there's a joy in that, Whereas on another way you could say, well, this guy lives in poverty and he's isolated from the European culture that he loved. He should be miserable. And yet, even in saying all this, I feel somehow or other, I can't tell you why her artistry is so successful in making me feel that I was in the Shimerda's living room. I met Antonia, and I'm better for having met her. And really to come upon that in sort of, in middle age. Evelyn Waugh said he didn't discover Henry James until middle age, and it was a great kindness that he hadn't used up Henry James. He loved Henry James so much until middle age. The only thing I'd slightly compare her to is a novel I've referred to you before, Anthony Powell's Dance to the Music of Time. It's over 12 volumes, and it is full of a lot more of the stuff that I normally like, ostentatiously witty conversation and all of that. But it also, in a sense, has a story but not a plot. It gives you, reviewers have said of it, nothing gives you the sense so much of time passing in real life as a dance to the music of time. So nothing no great issue is ever resolved or even, in a sense, ever joined in A Dance to the Music of Time. It's a novel, you might say, of manners and dialogue and psychology, whereas Willa Cather is a novel of landscape and manners, meaning the way people actually live, and psychology or spirituality, really. So, as I say, it doesn't have all that stuff that you normally like in a novel. You couldn't even really say where the climax is or anything like that.
I don't think there is one. I think it's a novel without one. Why do you think it never really... Why do you think she hasn't found fame outside of America? Do you think it's because it's too... Well, I mean, we've just said that the theme's universal, so there's no reason why it shouldn't appeal to people outside America. But was it because she was not wanting to sound like, identity politics? Is it because she was a woman? Is it because she just didn't... The books weren't taken on by scholars here, academics didn't discover her?
I think that's a really interesting question, Bella. Such an interesting question. There are many different angles to it. For a while, she was intensely popular within America. She won a Pulitzer Prize for one of her novels. Not, I think, one of her best novels, but that's normally the case with Pulitzer Prizes. They often get the right author. They almost never get the right book. and often enough, they get the wrong author too, But So for a time, she was immensely popular. So she did a very kind of traditional thing, although it was unusual to be a successful woman novelist at the time that she did, and unusual to write about the Midwest, even within America. America itself hadn't quite realised what a beautiful thing it had created in the Midwest, and so it was expected that novelists would come from New York or Boston or something like this rather than the Midwest. But she moved to New York and she worked in journalism and she honed her craft. She was like a lot of great writers. She was always writing. That was every day she worked at writing, and she worked and worked and worked. She wrote a lot of magazine journalism and she ghost wrote some books and so on. And always, now I think My Antonia was one of her first big successes. And partly, of course, it appealed to America because it was the story of immigrant success, and Americans can be proud of the Nebraska, the Midwest that Willa Cather produces. However, I think two things counted against her becoming massively popular, or perhaps three things. First of all, she never really fitted into any literary camp. So she was writing in the 19-teens and the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. And by then there was already a very high modernism in literature. And she didn't really fit into that camp. So a lot of, in the second half of her career, a lot of critics thought she wasn't radical enough. She didn't do enough experimentation. She wasn't James Joyce-ish enough. And then there's not much... transgressive sexual behaviour. I mean, people marry the wrong person and they have illegitimate babies and so on. But they're not. She really affirms the decencies of life. She doesn't attack them, and of course, she's quite conservative. Both personally, she didn't really let politics get into her books, but she was a conservative person. She's quite a devout Episcopalian. She really revered Roman Catholic liturgy and the tradition of Catholic art and so forth. So that meant that group of critics didn't quite like her. And then there were some critics who tried to recruit her to queer theory and everything. But what she wrote wasn't really, just the fact that she was a single woman and for a little while in her youth sort of wore slightly manly clothes and, for a brief time went under the name of Will rather than
Yes, that's
Willa.
right, Will, yeah.
And, I don't think it's fair to kind of interpret that more than she did herself. But so they wanted to recruit her to that school, but they couldn't quite do it. And then I think finally there's a bit of a prejudice in English and or British circles and the circles that derive from British circles like Australian circles against American novelists. Unless they are conferred with a Nobel Prize or something, it's different now, but I think in the 20s and 30s and 40s and so on, Australian audiences would naturally look to Britain.
Yes.
What did the Times say about it?
Yes.
It was hard enough for Australian authors to get a voice then, and in a sense, writing about the American Midwest would have seemed very exotic, a bit like writing about Thailand or something to an Australian audience. Having said that, her books are still in print in the United States in classic editions and so on, and they still have a respectable sale all the time.
I've got my vintage Penguin Cather here, Willa Cather, which is reprinted, which was last year. So it's obviously.
Oh, so that's in print now then.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's lovely. It's with a lovely.
Bella,
forward.
You're disillusioning me. You're telling me I could have bought this damn book in a regular bookstore.
You could have bought it in a regular bookstore
instead of traipsing all over every secondhand bookstore I ever knew, finding and thinking what a genius I was to get this ancient copy of Willa Cather's book.
I'm sure you enjoyed your visit to the bookshop. I think that was probably part of the thrill anyway, wasn't it, for you?
Oh yeah. I love secondhand bookstores.
You can probably even get this on Kindle. So I don't want to disillusion you even further, but it's probably widely accessible electronically.
I've never read a book on Kindle, but I have to say this is a bit vain of me. Of my 7 books, typically about 10% of their sales are on electronic devices. So God bless people who read books on Kindle.
But it doesn't mean you don't need to join them.
That's right.
No, it's a wonderful book. Actually, do you think it influenced Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird in that sort of coming of age genre, or do you think that's a little bit of a stretch?
No, I think it did have a big influence. So she occupies that very elusive and distinctive position of an artist who does innovate, but who doesn't innovate for the sake of innovation, and whose effects are very hard to reproduce. If you told me, would you like to read a book in which there is basically no plot,
no dialogue, no comedy, no banter?
Yeah. There is dialogue, but
no climax.
It's pretty straightforward dialogue, and there is humour, but it's wry humour and so on. I would say no, and if you said, do you want to read lengthy descriptions of landscape, especially landscape you've never seen and have no sympathy for, I would say no. Absolutely not. Death Comes for the Archbishop is set in New Mexico and is full of mesas and canyons and everything. I've never met a mesa or canyon in my long life. I've never shaken hands with them. I don't know what they're like. I don't know anything about them. But there I was, absolutely wrapped in these descriptions of them. And Willa Cather herself was loved Tolstoy, and she doesn't write like Tolstoy, but she loved the sort of the engagement with ideas and also the visual quality of Tolstoy's writing. But I do think there is also in many of her books a memory frame. So she doesn't do flashbacks and things. They're not discontinuous. She doesn't sort of jump from 1920 to 1870 and back to 1930. So all that kind of mad fashion, which just makes novels almost unreadable, and you want to throw them away the second time that happens, But she will frame a lot of her stories as a memory. So, this is very similar to Chris Koch does that with many of his novels too. So, and one of the reasons she did that, again, there was a formal technical reason for this. She didn't want to be the omniscient author who knew the innermost thoughts of every character. So she knew the innermost thoughts of her narrator, but then all the rest of her characters are simply observed by the narrator. Now, the narrator might speculate as to the innermost emotions of the character, but that he's describing. But basically, so it's show, don't tell. But on the other hand, narrating in the voice of a character allows her to make some comments legitimately as the character. So she wanted to be, I saw one critic say, halfway between the journalist who just reports what they see and the omniscient psychological novelist who pretends that they know the innermost truths of every human heart. And that's generally what I like, because what I want in literature is the innermost truths of every human heart. And it takes a much more accomplished level of artistry to get to those inner truths without, as it were, the inner voice,
Isn't that the answer to your question then? Why you like this novel so much? Have you not just answered your own question?
So nobody else may learn anything from these conversations, but I may, Bella. That's that could be. That could be. And then, you expect Jim Burden and Willa to have a romantic encounter because that's they're the two.
Yeah.
Antonia to have a.
You do.
Yeah, you do. But I must say, a lot of the greatest novels set that situation up and then don't consummate it. It's a bit like Dorothea and the Doctor in Middlemarch, which came out in installments. It was a serialised novel, and everyone thought these are the two great leads. Somehow or other, George Eliot is going to get them together. But by the end of 600 pages, they're not. And I think Middlemarch, too, is one of the greatest novels I've ever read. And it's the same, really, with Ralph Touchett and Isabel in Portrait of a Lady. The affection between them is overwhelming, and yet it's not an affection of eros. And I think our expectations are a bit narrow too. And again, life is like that. You have deep human attachments which don't automatically fall into the romantic love category. But did she influence other writers? I think she certainly did. The atmosphere of nostalgia, but not of overwhelming nostalgia. So everything is kind of in balance in Willa Cather. So Jim Burden is nostalgic, but he doesn't lament the past. He doesn't wish for the past. He just enjoys the past. And he enjoys going back to see Willa Cather. I've read so many novels where characters are reunited after many years and it's a terrible disappointment. And then they realise, that love is gone and everything. Instead of which, Jim Burden and Antonia can have a completely innocent and enjoyable reunion. Indeed, the husband is away, Antonia's husband, but then he comes back, and there's no suggestion of an unrequited love or an unfulfilled love or something. Jim Burden regrets Antonia's mistakes early on. He's kind of bitter with her, not that she didn't love him, but that she let herself fall down into a life which he thinks is beneath her. But it's part of the genius of the book that, in fact, she endows the life that she inhabits with a transcendent meaning and magnificent truth. And at the end, he realises she didn't live a life beneath her. She elevated the life of everyone around her.
And she elevated your life just by reading it.
I think so. You can never really claim a book has made you a better person because then you're trying to claim you're a good person, or you're a
bad person to start with, and you needed to make you a better person.
Exactly, you have to resort to that line of evil and wars that I mentioned to you in our last discussion. You think I'm crook now? Just imagine what I'd be without Christianity.
Imagine what you'd be like if you hadn't read about Antonia.
Well, that's right. So Bob Carr, who's read 1 million books, he answered an interview once. He said, "No, I can't claim that having read all these books makes me a better politician or anything like that. It was just necessary for me to read these books." Now, I think there is a tremendous value in great human literature, and I know, you've been involved in promoting the great books of Western civilization, and I think there is a deep value in reading them, but it's like going to church. The mere fact that you go to church doesn't actually guarantee you're going to be a good person, So the mere fact that you've read Willa Cather doesn't guarantee that you're going to lead a life of transcendent purpose and, make everyone around you happy that they've been around you. And yet the other thing, Bella, I'd say to you is, in my life, there are 2 or 3 people I'd say I've known whose presence is simply transforming. I was in hospital 25 or 28 years ago with my first iteration of heart disease, and it was like being in a conscript army. I was in a ward it was a big ward in those days, 8 or 10 other blokes. And one of the other blokes was a Syrian Christian. And Sam and I became the best of friends just for our 10-day stay in hospital. And Sam was a male version of Antonia. He was waiting for his operation so he could still walk around and everything. And so if somebody pressed the buzzer and the nurse didn't come, Sam would get up to them in the middle of the night and go and see if he could help them, make them a cup of tea, look after them, and so on. Sam and I sat out on the veranda one day at the hospital and talked about our lives for a couple of hours. And I realised that Sam was just one of these characters, whose kind of goodness radiated from him, unself-conscious goodness. I mean, he's a regular guy. He was a blind maker. He made Venetian blinds or something.
Yeah.
He wasn't a professor of literary theory or anything like that. But he was just somebody who could have figured in a Willa Cather novel. I don't think it's unrealistic to think of people like that.
No, I think that people do exist like that. And you met one in the form of Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we tried to keep in touch afterwards, but it's like you've been through a war together. I mean, it's old wartime buddies. You kind of get together on Anzac Day, but really, what you have in common is your time in the trenches.
Yeah.
Becomes a bit dull for anyone who wasn't there with you.
Well, I think it's a lovely novel, and it's been another absolutely fascinating conversation. And I hope people will read it. Actually, I hope now that we know that you can buy a Penguin copy in a local Dimmicks, it might be worth getting one while we're still all sort of in lockdown, because it's a lovely what's the word? It takes you out of your life for a while. What's the word I'm looking for?
It certainly succeeds that way. Like all great novels, it draws you into it. You're in Willa Cather's world.
Yes,
I mean, wherever you're reading it, that's where you are. You're in Nebraska, and there are worse places to be. That's right. And so it's a great novel to read in lockdown or something, because, mind you, I'm quite enjoying lockdown. I have to tell you, it's nice not having to go to work, and everything is terrific. But
it's not going to last forever, Greg.
No. In any circumstance, it's nice to read Willa Cather, and it's not like Tolstoy or something. It's only 370 pages. So
yes, it's not like our previous Sword of Honor trilogy.
Well, I always, I said to you, you've got to read that as 3 separate books. I wouldn't have read it if I'd picked it up as a 900-page book. I would have said, "Oh no, cut it out." But I got suckered into it by reading Volume 1, and then following it was finding it was a Netflix binge experience. I had to keep binging on it, and I binged on Willa Cather too. I just went round buying book after book of hers. And
well, look, if we'd had 6 favourite books, I think maybe her other novel might have featured as your 6th favourite. But unfortunately, we've only got 2 more to discuss.
Absolutely. So the other one of hers that I think is best is Death Comes for the Archbishop. But I thought I shouldn't do too many male-centred religious books in particular, and
this is very diverse. She ticks the boxes. So we've got
but I have to say, it's honestly one of my very favourite novels, and the only one, as I say, I've come upon, in the last 6 or 7 years, which has really revolutionised my view of what novels can do and literature. And I was like a kid again, in love with an author. That way you get when you're an obsessive reading kid, and you read some author and you love him, and you've got to buy every single book that he ever wrote.
I did that with Richmore Crompton's William books. I bought them every week that they came out with a new one. I had all 24 volumes.
That's pretty good. All 24. Yeah. That's fantastic. Yeah. Well, P.G. Wodehouse, who we'll discuss in a subsequent conversation, he wrote over 100 books, and I've got all of them. And
incredible.
It's a lot of books. It's a lot of books. No television. Well, I look forward to discussing that next week. And it's not going to be the obvious one that people are thinking about, but we'll keep it a surprise until our next podcast. Thanks so much, Bella.
Thank you so much.
It's criminal to enjoy this as much as I do, but there you go.
Not at all. It's fantastic.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks. Sign up today for only $55 and we'll also send you a free copy of the first book, The Year of Living Dangerously by Christopher Koch, which will be signed by Greg and myself. Plus, you'll also be invited to a very special online town hall event that we're having in August, where you can ask Greg any questions that you have about his choice of books. I'm so excited to be sharing this new series with you. For all the details, head to ipa.org.au.